Okay, welcome back to the final part of our discussion on race and child welfare. So hopefully you've had a chance to go look at some of the links to promising innovations that are attempting to address racial disparities. Now we're going to finish this discussion talking about cultural responsiveness, cultural competence. And I want to just also tie this discussion back to our earlier discussions about the main child welfare goals, the mandates, the federal mandates for child welfare agencies is to achieve the safety, permanence, and child well-being for all children and families that come to the attention of CPS. And thinking about how this might intersect with some of the racial disparities that we've been talking about, the historical trauma, in thinking about how these goals intersect with that. So this is going to be one of the questions I have, reflective questions that I'll have available to you to answer, and to think through some of that a little bit more. But one of the pieces that jurisdictions often talk about and attempt to achieve is cultural competence. And so we're going to spend a few minutes to talk about what does that mean, cultural competence? What might this mean when we're working with children, youth, and families? And for this discussion, I'm using Terry Cross's model of cultural competence. And you can see the citation there. This is also the handout that I have, so you can refer back to this handout, which is in the module as well. So what is cultural competence? He defines it as a defined set of values and principles that demonstrate across behaviors, attitudes, policies that allow people in an organization to work effectively cross-culturally. It includes the capacity to value diversity, to be self-aware, self-reflective, conduct self-assessments for your own bias, acknowledging your own privilege or difference, managing the dynamics of difference, so the interactional dynamics of difference, acquiring cultural knowledge and being able to institutionalize this. So using that knowledge of cultures to change practice so that it's respective across cultures. And as well as adapting to the diversity and cultural context of the multiple communities that agencies may serve. Cross would also state that these elements need to be incorporated across the entire dynamic of the agency. So all aspects of policy making, administrative decisions, formal and informal processes within an agency, the organizational culture, how you deliver services, the individual practice, involving, and really this requires then, if you're doing all of this, it requires involvement of consumers, the people that you're working with, key stakeholders, and the communities that you're working with. And so this is the foundation that Cross uses to talk about cultural competence. And he provides a continuum. And so this is what the handout lays out, are the different elements of this continuum. And I'm just going to spend, I think he does a really nice job laying these out, but I'm just going to spend a few minutes to highlight a few points for each of these. So cultural destructiveness. This is obviously one far end of the continuum. And so this is really blatant attempts to destroy the culture of a given group. You know, we talked about this with things like cultural genocide, white supremacy, the assumption that one group is actually superior to another. And so this is clearly one extreme end of the continuum, that it's intentional, that it's blatant. If we move along the continuum, he defines this next phase as cultural incapacity. So this is describing practices, interactions, where someone lacks the capacity to be responsive to different groups, but it may not be intentional. So they're not intentionally feeling like one group is superior to the other, but they might fail to recognize that there's real implications for disparities, institutionalized racism that are due to cultural differences. And so because they're not acknowledging some of these things, they're not able to respond effectively. But again, this is a little bit different because it's not intentional, but you still might fail to acknowledge things like microaggressions, institutional racism. That may also still be true for this next group. So for moving up the continuum, this is what he calls cultural denial or indifference, or may also be thought of as cultural blindness. I'm colorblind. If someone says something like that, race doesn't matter. I see all people the same. And so why is that a problem? Some people might think, well, that's a positive, that's a positive statement if we're not using race to define people. The problem with that is that in believing that culture makes no difference, is that it fosters the assumption that people are all basically alike, so that what works with members of one culture, say the dominant culture, should work with all members of other cultures. Because if we're all fundamentally the same, then we don't have to acknowledge real differences. We don't have to maybe try to be culturally sensitive or culturally responsive, because we're all the same. We can just do one thing. And of course, the problem with that is that one thing that works for this group is oftentimes the mainstream dominant culture. And so it's often underlying with things like white privilege, not recognizing that the values and the ways of viewing the world and the ways of doing things that should just work for all groups is actually a very specific, has that very specific base in the dominant culture. And so the idea that culture makes no difference one of the things that may underlie that, Cross would argue, is this idea of white privilege, that you're not acknowledging some of these real disparities. So we're moving up the continuum a little bit more. This is what he would call cultural pre-competence. So what is cultural pre-competence? This is where we've moved away from colorblindness. So you're acknowledging that there are important differences, and instead of disengaging with those differences, that we're acknowledging those differences. So you're actively pursuing knowledge about different cultures, and you're not just stopping there, but you're attempting to integrate that into the delivery of service and how you're interacting with clients as an agency and how you're delivering those services that fits best with the different cultures and communities that you're working with. So pre-competence, if an agency is at this stage, it's encouraging learning and understanding of new ideas. It's trying to move towards solutions to improve services. So they're actually starting to make positive changes in the service delivery. So then what comes after pre-competence is cultural competence. So this is how Cross would define cultural competence. That agency has the capacity to function in an effective manner within the context of the targeted group. So you're working effectively across communities. You have not just acceptance, but respect for differences, acknowledging those differences. You have systems in place that promote continual self-assessment. You're constantly paying attention to the dynamics of privilege, power, and difference. And so you're not sitting back and just assuming that things will work out if you've changed your practice. You're continually self-assessing your practices and looking at these dynamics of power, privilege, and difference to make sure that your services remain culturally competent and culturally responsive. And you're always coming with a not knowing perspective of continual expansion of knowledge about the targeted group. So it's that kind of growth mentality where you're always looking to learn more, that you don't feel like, okay, now I've got it all figured out. You're constantly trying to improve, be reflective as an agency or an individual. And then finally, he describes this final stage, the other end of the extreme, as cultural proficiency. And these are, individuals, agencies that are proactively regarding cultural differences, promoting cultural relations. Often, these may be kind of role models that people look to around questions of cultural competence. And so they're seen as culturally competent and proficient by those around them as well. And so that would be kind of an elite group that might not just be culturally competent, but culturally proficient. And so I wanted to provide this framework. And again, one of the reflective questions that that you can tackle for this module is thinking about this question of cultural competence along this continuum. There's other models out there as well. So, we're just using this one as a framework. But thinking about where you might fall on this as a practitioner, as a social worker, where might you fall on this continuum? Where might your agencies, where you're doing your field placements, where might they fall on this continuum of cultural competence? And thinking about this as we're trying to make positive changes, addressing things like institutional racism, individual bias. And so I think this question of cultural competence can help us answer some of those questions. So this part of the module is complete. Please refer back to the module for both reflective questions and the other resources on this topic of race and child welfare, and so that we can complete the discussion on racial disparities and racial equity in child welfare. Thanks very much for your participation.